So before we start this video, update on the last video, the EU copyright reform has passed the Legal Affairs Committee of the European Parliament. However, this does not mean that it has passed. It just means that it hasn't been blocked. There is still the parliamentary vote happening, probably on the 4th of July, interestingly enough. And even if it passes there, which is unlikely, there are still the EU courts, because again, this is against standing EU law. Experts agree that it is unlikely to pass either of these two future stages, but then experts also agree that Donald Trump wasn't going to be president of the United States. So get calling your MEPs. Interestingly enough, both Eurosceptic organizations in the EU were in favor of upload filters on this Legal Affairs Committee vote, as opposed to just the conservative EU skeptics. The Eurosceptic votes could have made sure that neither Article 11 nor Article 13 would have been there at all, and we could have been done with this by now. But because the EU has to be bad and evil for these people to have any credibility, they voted in favor of this horrible legislation. Funny how that goes. Whenever I make a video on millennials, there's a lot of interesting discussions going on in the comment section. There's the boomers discussing just how much of a lazy head of hair I am, and whether I should be growing a spine or a pair. There's the 16-year-old ANCAPs who are discussing whether I am paid by George Soros and the big government industry, or if I just don't understand economics. There's the solipsists who discuss with themselves how their personal experiences as a poor boomer or a wealthy millennial disprove the statistics on how the rest of society lives. There's the sycophants discussing who to buy the pitchforks from, so they can kill literally every single boomer in existence. There's the footwear manufacturers discussing whether they should put bootstraps on other clothing items, so people have more of a chance to pull themselves up by them. But the most interesting of all of these isn't part of any of the discussions. In fact, it is an army of comments who are incredibly glad that they are not part of this terrible millennial generation. And I'm sorry to tell you guys this, right? But the vast majority of you are actually millennials. You just don't know what a millennial is. Which, to be fair, you're not alone with this, right? Even scholars in this field cannot agree on exact dates, or even non-exact dates, where to put the brackets on, in this area is where all the millennials were born. Which, and this is a whole subplot of this discussion, what generation you are part of is 100% exclusively contingent on what date you were born on. This whole, oh, I was born in 1990, but I don't conform to all the millennial stereotypes, so I'm not a millennial thing, is absolutely laughable, right? Most millennials don't conform to the millennial stereotypes, you absolute merchant. So no, person who thinks they are not a millennial, you are probably. I've been skirting around this topic for several reasons. One, as I have already said, there is no clear consensus on what is and what isn't a millennial date-wise. And to be honest, I find hard lines in these kind of discussions counterproductive anyway. I mean, a millennial born in 1980 will have more in common with a Gen Xer born in 1979 than a millennial born in 1999. There were millennials among the 9/11 hijackers, for fuck's sake. While at the same time, there were millennials alive during 9/11 that weren't old enough to be forming memories yet. Also, the whole millennials label isn't so much about millennials as an age group. It's about the poor and societally destitute young people. Millennials, when I use the term, does not so much describe a strictly walled-off age group, but a group of young people who experience certain economic and cultural and societal circumstances during their youth. But I shall placate all of you and now define millennials as a strictly walled-off group. If you've been watching my channel for a while, you will know that I am a big fan of Strauss-Howe generational theory, if only for the memes. Strauss-Howe defines generations not by fixed intervals, but by key events and topics that are in the zeitgeist of the current era. And usually it's around 20 years that generations are born in. Which 20 years, that's really just the common interval that most scholars agree is round about how long a generation lasts. but they can never agree which generation starts which 20 years when, and if it's just 20 years or maybe sometimes 18 years or 25 years, it's really chaotic. Generation X, for instance, is commonly defined as starting in the 60s, then going through the 70s, and stopping in the early 80s. They are the generation that was born while the baby boomers were young, which in turn the baby boomers started being born in the 40s and the 50s and then stopped in the 60s. And also Generation Z is usually defined as starting around 2000, and they will continue to be born until 2020, which is in 2 years! What the fuck? Jesus Christ! Millennials in Strauss-Howe theory are defined as people born between 1982 and 2004, which, to be honest, I find a bit far-reaching and also pointless. I mean, if generations are just going to be labels that define when you were born, why tie them to cultural events that may or may not have had any impact on these people at all? Defining generations by culture and not by arbitrary time frame makes them useless as demographics tools. Because even though the people in the time frame will have been impacted by similar events, not all of them will have come out the same out of experiencing those things. You could, for instance, make the case that people born from 95 onward are Generation Z because they were impacted by things that previous generations did not have to deal with in their teenage years, chiefly social media. This would make me Generation Z because I was born in 95, but that would also mean that all the millennial crybaby bully snowflakes are also Gen Z people and not millennials, because they too were born 95 forward. So let's just say that millennials were born from 1980 to 1999, because let's be honest, it doesn't really matter. Personally, I like to separate millennials into two groups. You have the early millennials, which were born in the 80s, which we will call pre-crisis millennials. Then you have the late millennials, which were born in the 90s, which we will call post-crisis millennials. Because let's be honest, the 2008 financial crisis is the main thing that has impacted our lives as young adults. It is the core reason why we cannot get a leg up in society. Pre-crisis millennials were legally adults when the financial crisis happened. They were trained, educated, already in the job market, already to enter the job market, to ride out the last remaining bits of the wave of optimism and productivity and getting paid for your work that previous generations enjoyed, though they could see it waning on the horizon. Then the financial crisis hit, and though they were part of the job market back then and the economy, pre-crisis millennials are not to blame for the crisis. They were the bottom tier, the lowest rung of the economy at the time. They did not hold any power, they did not make the crisis happen. They were, however, the ones most impacted by it, because what little savings and what little lives they had been able to carve out for themselves were suddenly destroyed, and they found themselves without jobs, without homes, and without prospects. For post-crisis millennials, an economy and job market ravaged by the impact of the financial crisis has always been the shaping force of their adult lives. So pre-crisis millennials lost everything they were able to build for themselves before the crisis, and post-crisis millennials never even had the chance to build such a safety net up for themselves in the first place. This is why pre-crisis millennials are disgruntled and post-crisis millennials are hopeless. Pre-crisis millennials are often still hoping that if they just work hard enough, one day the world where you actually get paid money for your hard work and investment will return, while post-crisis millennials, who have never experienced such a world, are looking for alternatives that may or may not result in big problems. So yeah, that's the conundrum we find ourselves in today. That is, I think, a much more plausible and definition of generations that makes more sense, instead of just having the cultural uniting thing that isn't really there much. Thank you very much for watching this video. This was a short one. I am having a vacation after all, which I think this is the 7th day of my 9th day vacation, and I haven't not worked for a single day. Which that's very, I am failing to vacation. Like, comment, subscribe, do the things, follow me on the Twitter and the Twitch. Consider supporting me on Make a Support or Patreon, whichever you prefer. I greatly appreciate both of them. Thank you very much for watching. Join my Discord, I forgot that one. I always forget that one, even though the Discord is a very fun place where you can, if you support me on Patreon or Maker Support, you can get special ranks and privileges. Imagine that. So yeah, whether you're a pre-crisis millennial or a post-crisis millennial or any other generation, have a great day and see you around, cunts.